In the unforgiving heat of the Wyoming Territory, blood runs thicker than water, but gold weighs heavier than both. Most history books won't tell you about the women traded like cattle during the Great Drought of 1881. They won't mention Elspeth Callaway, the girl whose own father looked her in the eye and deemed her useless before shaking hands with the devil. But the mountains remember. This isn't a fairy tale of knights and castles. It is the brutal, true account of a woman sold to settle a whiskey tab, and the terrifying scarred recluse who bought her not to own her, but to challenge the very definition of a home. This is the story of how a transaction became a transformation. The saloon in Sweetwater was less a building and more a collection of rotting timber holding hands against the wind. It smelled of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and the copper tang of desperation. For Elspeth Callaway, it smelled like the end of the world. She stood by the door, the wood of the frame digging into her shoulder blade through her thin calico dress. She was 19, though the sun and the starvation of the last 3 years made her look closer to 30. Her hands clasped in front of her were red and chapped, the knuckles swollen from scrubbing floors that never stayed clean. At the bar, the man who was supposed to protect her, her father, Josiah Callaway, was currently haggling over her life as if she were a lame horse. "She eats too much, Zeke," Josiah slurred, slamming an empty glass onto the scarred mahogany. "And look at her, skinny as a rail, can't pull a plow, can't birth a calf. She's useless on the farm since her ma died." Zeke Pardon, the man Josiah was speaking to, laughed. It was a wet, ugly sound. Pardon owned the bank, the general store, and effectively the souls of half the town. He was a man built of soft dough and hard malice. He turned on his stool, his eyes raking over Elspeth with a proprietary sneer that made her stomach turn over. "She ain't much to look at, Josiah," Pardon agreed, wiping foam from his mustache. "But I suppose I need someone to wash my linens and keep the floors swept at the manor. My last girl ran off with a trapper." $50, Josiah said. "And you wipe the debt on the seed feed." Elspeth didn't move. She had learned long ago that tears only made Josiah angry, and anger made his fists heavy. She looked at the floorboards, counting the knots in the wood. 1, 2, 3. If she counted enough of them, maybe she would disappear. 20, Pardon counted. "And I keep the deed to the south pasture until you pay the rest." "Done," Josiah said too quickly. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Elspeth felt her knees buckle, but she locked them. Sold. She was being sold for $20 and a pasture. The reality of it was so absurd, so grotesque, that she felt a hysterical laugh bubbling in her throat. "Wait." The voice came from the back of the room, from a table shrouded in shadow. It was a deep voice, rough like gravel grinding under a wagon wheel. The saloon went quiet. Even the piano player, a blind man named Old Thomas, lifted his hands from the keys. A chair scraped against the floor. A man stood up. He was massive, easily 6'4", with shoulders that blocked out the dim light from the dirty window. He wore buckskins that were stained with grease and pine pitch, and a heavy bear fur coat despite the heat. A beard thick and dark covered half his face, but it couldn't hide the jagged white scar that ran from his left temple down to his jawline, pulling his eye into a permanent skeptical squint. This was Tobias Rourke. The townspeople called him the Ghost of the Bighorns. He came down from the mountains only twice a year to trade furs for powder and salt. He never spoke more than necessary. He never smiled. Rumor said he had killed a grizzly with a knife. Rumor said he had killed men for less. Tobias walked to the bar, his boots heavy on the floorboards. The jingle of spurs was the only sound in the room. He stopped between Josiah and Pardon, towering over them both. "The girl," Tobias said. He didn't look at Elspeth. He looked at Josiah. "She ain't for sale." Josiah bristled, fueled by liquid courage. "Now look here, Rourke. This is family business. You stick to your bears and your rocks." Family. Tobias repeated the word, tasting like ash in his mouth. He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy leather pouch. He dropped it on the bar. It landed with a heavy, dull thud that spoke of gold, not silver. "There's 5 ounces of dust in there, worth a hell of a lot more than $20. Payden's eyes widened. He reached for the pouch, but Tobias's hand, large, scarred, and calloused, slammed down on top of it. "This buys her debt," Tobias growled, his voice low and dangerous, "and it buys her freedom from the likes of you." Well, Josiah stammered, looking from the dangerous mountain man to the pouch of gold. Greed won out over pride instantly. "If you want the useless chit that's him at bad, she's yours. Just don't come asking for a refund when she burns your supper." Tobias didn't answer. He picked up the pouch and shoved it into Josiah's chest, hard enough to knock the wind out of the older man. Then he turned to Elspeth. For the first time, she looked up. His eyes were a startling icy blue, contrasting sharply with his weathered skin. They weren't kind eyes exactly. They were guarded hard and intense. But they weren't cruel. "Get your things," Tobias said. I don't have anything," Elspeth whispered, her voice cracking from disuse. "Good," Tobias said. "Then there's nothing to drag you down." He turned and walked out of the saloon, the doors swinging wildly behind him. Elspeth stood, frozen for a heartbeat. She looked at Pardon, who was glaring at her with thwarted lust, and at her father, who was already untying the pouch of gold with shaking hands. She realized then that she had no choice. She could stay and belong to Pardon, or she could follow the monster into the mountains. Elspeth turned and ran after the boots. The journey up the mountain was not a rescue. It was an endurance test. They had been riding for 3 days. Tobias rode a massive roan stallion he called simply Horse, while Elspeth sat atop a stubborn mule named Jack that Tobias had purchased at the livery stable before they left town. He hadn't asked her if she could ride. He had simply pointed to the mule and said, "Keep up." The landscape had shifted dramatically. The brown, dusty plains of Sweetwater had given way to the rolling foothills, and now they were deep in the timberline of the Bighorn Mountains. The air here was thin and sharp, smelling of pine needles and damp earth. It was colder, too. Elspeth shivered in her thin dress, wrapping her arms around herself as the mule plodded over the rocky trail. Tobias rode ahead, a silent sentinel. He hadn't spoken a word to her since they left the town limits. He didn't check on her. He didn't offer her his coat. He simply rode his eyes scanning the horizon for threats, cougars, wolves, or worse, men. Elspeth's mind was a whirlwind of terror and confusion. Why did he buy me? The question haunted her. Men didn't spend 5 ounces of gold out of charity. She had heard the stories about the mountain men. They were savages, living like animals, taking what they wanted. Was she to be a servant, a prisoner, or something worse? As the sun began to dip below the peaks, casting long purple shadows across the snow-dusted path, Elspeth's mule stumbled on a loose rock. She wasn't strong enough to correct him. She slid sideways, crying out as she hit the hard ground. The impact knocked the wind out of her, and she lay there, staring up at the sliver of blue sky between the towering pines. She expected a shout, a curse, a blow. Instead, the crunch of boots on snow approached. A large shadow fell over her. Tobias stood there looking down. He didn't offer a hand. "You hurt?" he asked. "No," she lied, pushing herself up. Her ankle throbbed and her hands were scraped raw. "I'm fine." "You're not fine," Tobias stated flatly. "You're weak. Your father starved you." It wasn't an insult. It was an observation delivered with the same clinical detachment one might use to describe a lame horse. He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a strip of dried venison. He tossed it to her. "Eat. Chew it slow." Elspeth caught the meat, her hands trembling. She bit into it. It was salty and tough, but the flavor exploded in her mouth. She hadn't realized how hungry she was until that moment. She ate voraciously, tearing at the jerky. Tobias watched her, his expression unreadable. "Why didn't you run?" he asked suddenly. Elspeth paused mid-chew. "What? Back in town, when I walked out, you could have run the other way. Why follow me?" Elspeth swallowed the dry meat with difficulty. There was nowhere to run. Pardon owns the town. My father owns the farm. The world is small for people like me, Mr. Rourke. "Tobias," he corrected. "Mr. Rourke was my grandfather. He was a bastard." "Tobias," she tested the name. It felt heavy on her tongue. "Why did you pay for me?" He looked away, staring up the trail where the peaks disappeared into the clouds. He seemed to be debating whether to answer. Finally, he spat on the ground. "Silence," he said. "Silence. A house needs noise to be a home, they say. But I've had too much silence. And yet—" He looked back at her, his blue eyes piercing. "I can't stand the chatter of townfolk. You looked like you knew how to be quiet." It was a strange, cryptic answer. "He bought me because I'm quiet. Get on the mule," he ordered, turning back to his horse. "We make the cabin by nightfall or we freeze." The last leg of the journey was brutal. The trail became a goat path, winding along the edge of sheer cliffs that dropped thousands of feet into darkness. Elspeth closed her eyes, trusting the mule more than she trusted herself. The wind howled now, biting through her dress like needles. Just as she thought she would slide off the mule from sheer exhaustion, the trees opened up. They had arrived at a plateau, a hidden shelf on the side of the mountain. Nestled against a wall of granite was a cabin. It was not the shack she expected. It was a sturdy structure of heavy logs chinked with mud and moss. Smoke curled from a stone chimney. A lean-to stable stood to the side, and a stack of firewood was piled high against the wall. It looked strong, permanent. Tobias dismounted and led his horse to the stable. Elspeth slid off the mule, her legs collapsing under her. She fell into the snow. This time, Tobias was there. He didn't pick her up gently like a groom carrying a bride. He hoisted her over his shoulder like a sack of flour. "Put me down!" she gasped, hammering on his back. "Stop squirming!" he grunted. He kicked the door open. Inside the cabin was warm. A fire crackled in the hearth. The air smelled of wood smoke, curing leather and sage. It was sparse, a table, 2 chairs, a bunk in the corner, and shelves lined with jars. But it was clean. He dumped her onto the bunk. It was covered in a buffalo robe that was softer than anything she had ever touched. "Stay," he commanded. He went to the fire, stirring a pot that hung over the flames. He ladled stew into a wooden bowl and brought it to her along with a tin cup of water. "Eat. Sleep. Tomorrow you work." Elspeth took the bowl. "What work?" she asked, her voice trembling. What do you want from me?" Tobias stood by the fireplace, the flames casting dancing shadows across his scarred face. He looked at her, and for a second she saw something behind the ice in his eyes. Was it loneliness or regret? "I want you to prove him wrong," Tobias said softly. "Who?" "Your father. He said you were useless." Tobias turned his back to her, looking into the fire. "Up here, useless things die. If you want to live, Elspeth, you have to find a use." He walked to the door, grabbing a blanket from a hook. "Where are you going?" she asked. "To the stable. You take the bed." "But this is your home." Tobias stopped at the door. "You're in it now. That makes it complicated." He walked out, shutting the heavy door against the wind. Elspeth sat alone in the warmth, the bowl of stew warming her hands. She looked around the sturdy cabin, listening to the wind howl outside a wolf trying to blow the house down. She was sold. She was terrified. She was miles from civilization with a man who could snap her neck with one hand. But as she took a spoonful of the stew rich with venison and root vegetables, she realized something else. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't hungry. And for the first time in her life, the door was locked from the inside. Morning in the Bighorns did not break. It shattered. The sun didn't gently rise. It struck the white peaks with blinding violence, reflecting off the snow until the world was nothing but glare and ice. Elspeth woke to the sound of a door slamming. She bolted upright on the bunk, her heart hammering against her ribs. The cabin was empty. The fire had burned down to embers, and the air was biting cold. Her breath plumed in front of her face in ragged gasps. For a moment she forgot where she was. She looked for the water bucket she usually had to haul for her father, or the belt he left on the table as a threat. Then she saw the log walls, the heavy beams, the silence. Tobias. She threw the buffalo robe aside and scrambled out of bed. She was still wearing her travel-stained dress. Her feet hit the cold wood floor, and she winced. Her ankle was swollen, turning a mottled purple. She limped to the window. Outside the world was a terrifying expanse of white and grey. Tobias was nowhere to be seen. The horse was gone from the corral. Panic, cold and sharp, spiked in her chest. He left me. The thought was irrational. His things were here, but abandonment was the only language she knew. He realized, I'm useless, just like Pa said. He's gone to trade me, or leave me to the wolves. No, she whispered, her voice shaking. I have to be useful. I have to earn my keep. She looked around the cabin. It was messy in a masculine way. Tools scattered a pile of unwashed tin plates, mud tracked in near the door. I can clean, she thought. I can do that. She set to work with a feverish intensity. She swept the floor with a bundle of stiff twigs she found by the hearth until her palms blistered. She hauled water from the rain barrel outside, breaking the layer of ice with a heavy ladle, ignoring the way the freezing water numbed her fingers until they felt like dead wood. She scrubbed the tin plates with sand and ash until they shone. By noon, the cabin was spotless, but the fire was dying. Elspeth stared at the hearth. She needed wood. She limped outside to the woodpile. There was a splitting maul, leaning against a stump, a heavy iron-headed beast of a tool. She grabbed the handle. It was smooth from Tobias's grip, but it was heavy. Impossibly heavy. She set a log on the stump. She raised the maul. Please, she grunted, swinging it down. The head missed the log entirely, the momentum twisting her wrists and sending a shock wave of pain up her arms. The maul buried itself in the dirt. She tried again. And again. On the fourth try, she chipped the bark. On the fifth, she hit the log, but the blade stuck fast. She tugged at it, sobbing in frustration, her boots slipping in the mud. "Come on," she screamed at the wood tears freezing on her cheeks. "Just break." She was useless. She couldn't even chop wood. If she couldn't keep the fire going, they would freeze. She was a liability, a waste of 5 ounces of gold. Defeated, she went back inside to try the only other thing she knew cooking. She found a sack of flour and a tin of lard. She would make biscuits. Her mother had taught her before she passed. But the stove here was different, a cast-iron beast she didn't understand. She stoked the embers too hot. She mixed the dough with shaking hands, guessing the measurements. She shoved the pan into the oven. 20 minutes later, smoke billowed into the room. Elspeth pulled the pan out, coughing. The biscuits were black pucks of charcoal on the bottom and raw dough in the middle. The smell of burnt flour filled the small space, choking out the scent of pine. She stared at the ruined food, her hands covered in white flour, shaking uncontrollably. The door opened. Tobias filled the frame, a dead deer slung over his shoulders. He dropped the carcass on the porch and stepped inside, stomping snow from his boots. He stopped dead. He looked at the smoke. He looked at the biscuits. He looked at the axe she had left buried in the dirt outside the handle, sticking up like a monument to her failure. Then he looked at Elspeth. She backed away until her spine hit the rough logs of the wall. She closed her eyes, waiting for the shout, waiting for the backhand. "I tried," she whispered the words, strangling her. "I'm sorry. I tried to make supper. I tried to cut the wood. I'll fix it. Please don't put me out." Silence stretched heavy and suffocating. She heard his heavy boots cross the floor. She flinched as he got close. "Open your eyes," Tobias said. His voice wasn't angry. It was tired. Elspeth opened them. Tobias was standing 2 feet away. He wasn't looking at the burnt biscuits. He was looking at her hands. He reached out and took her left hand in his. His grip was enormous, swallowing her fingers, but he was gentle. He turned her palm up. It was red raw and bleeding where the broom and the cold water had cracked her skin. The blisters from the axe handle had already burst. "You've never chopped wood in your life, have you?" he asked. "No." She admitted shame burning her face. "Pa said it was men's work. I wanted to help. And the biscuits. The stove is too hot." Tobias let go of her hand. He walked to the stove, grabbed a rag and picked up a biscuit. He tapped it against the table. Clack, clack. It sounded like a rock. He tossed it back on the tray. "Your father was right," Tobias said. The world dropped out from under Elspeth. A sob escaped her throat. "About the farm." Tobias continued, turning to face her. "You're useless on a farm. You don't know how to plow. You don't know how to chop. You don't know how to cook on a wood stove." He walked over to a shelf and pulled down a small tin jar. He returned to her, unscrewing the lid. The smell of pungent herbs and bear grease wafted out. "Give me your hands." "What?" "Give me your hands, Elspeth." She held them out. He scooped a glob of the salve and began to rub it into her raw knuckles. The heat of his hands was shocking against her cold skin. He worked the grease into the cracks, his thumbs moving with a surprising calloused grace. "You're useless on a farm," he repeated, his eyes focused on her palm. "But we aren't on a farm. We're on a mountain. The rules are different here. I ruined the flower, she whispered. We have more flour. I can't chop wood. I chop the wood, he said firmly. That's my job. Your job right now is to heal those hands so you can actually hold a tool without bleeding on it. He finished with her hands and looked her in the eye. I didn't buy a servant, Elspeth. If I wanted a cook, I would have married the baker's widow in Sweetwater. She makes fine pies and talks until your ears bleed. A tiny hysterical giggle escaped Elspeth. She clamped her hand over her mouth. Tobias's mouth twitched almost a smile, but not quite. I bought you because I saw a survivor, he said, his voice dropping an octave. You survived a man like Josiah Calloway for 19 years. That takes a kind of strength an axe can't give you. But up here, strength looks different. You have to learn it. And you can't learn it if you're terrified. I'm going to hit you every time you burn a biscuit. He walked back to the door. Scrape the burnt parts off. We'll eat the dough in a stew. I'm going to dress the deer. You stay inside and keep the fire alive. Can you do that? Elspeth nodded. Tears streaming freely now, but they weren't tears of fear. Yes, I can do that. Good. Tobias walked out. Elspeth stood there, her hands stinging pleasantly from the salve, the smell of burnt flour still in the air. She wasn't useful. Not yet. But for the first time in her life, she was allowed to be incompetent without being punished. She picked up the knife to scrape the biscuits. Winter in the Bighorns was a siege. By December, the snow was 5 feet deep, drifting up against the cabin walls until it blocked out the lower half of the windows. The world shrank down to the 20 by 20 foot interior of the cabin. For weeks, Elspeth and Tobias moved around each other like planets in a tight orbit. The silence Tobias prized so much began to change. It was no longer the tense silence of strangers. It was a companionable quiet. Elspeth learned the rhythm of the mountain. She learned that when the wind blew from the north, she needed to stack extra wood by the door. She learned that when Tobias sharpened his knife with a specific rhythmic shing-shing, he was thinking deep thoughts and shouldn't be disturbed. She also learned that Tobias Rourke was not a monster. He was a man made of scars and solitude. One evening a blizzard howled outside, shaking the sturdy door in its frame. Tobias sat by the fire, cleaning his rifle, a Winchester Model 1876. A heavy, beautiful weapon he treated with more tenderness than he did himself. Elspeth was mending one of his woolen shirts. Her sewing skills honed by years of fixing her father's clothes so he wouldn't have to spend money on new ones were excellent. Tobias looked up from the gun oil. You have a steady hand. Elspeth looked up startled. It's just a hem. It's a straight hem. My stitching looks like a drunk spider walked across the cloth. He set the rifle down. Come here. Elspeth put the shirt down and walked over. She was no longer afraid to approach him. He handed her the rifle. It was heavy, smelling of steel and oil. Do you know how to use this? He asked. No. Pa said guns were for men. Tobias snorted. Your pa was a fool who wanted a victim, not a daughter. Up here, a gun doesn't care if you're a man or a woman. It only cares if your aim is true. If a cougar comes through that window, you can't wait for me to get home. He stood up and moved behind her. Shoulder it. Like this. He guided her arms. His chest pressed against her back, radiating heat. For a moment, Elspeth stopped breathing. He was so large, so solid. His beard grazed the top of her head. It was an intimate proximity, shocking and electric. Lean into it, he murmured, his voice rumbling in his chest against her spine. It kicks like a mule. If you stand stiff, it'll knock you flat. You have to be the rock. Elspeth tightened her grip, looking down the sights at a knot in the wall. Breathe out, Tobias instructed. Squeeze, don't pull. She mimicked the motion. Click. Good, Tobias said. He didn't step away immediately. He stayed there for a heartbeat longer than necessary, his hand lingering on her elbow. Then he cleared his throat and stepped back, the cold air rushing into the space between them. Tomorrow, if the storm breaks, we shoot for real. The storm did break, revealing a world of blinding crystal. Tobias set up targets, empty tin cans on the fence posts. The first time Elspeth fired, the recoil bruised her shoulder, and she missed the can by 3 feet. Again, Tobias said. She fired until her shoulder throbbed and her ears rang. But by the afternoon, she hit a can. It spun off the post with a satisfying ping. Elspeth turned to Tobias, a wide, genuine smile breaking across her face. It was the first time he had ever seen her truly smile. It transformed her. She wasn't the gaunt, terrified girl from the saloon. She was radiant. I got it, she cheered. Tobias stared at her, struck dumb. He felt something crack inside his chest, some old, frozen fortification giving way. You got it, he agreed, his voice rough. But the mountain does not tolerate joy without a price. 2 days later, Tobias went to check the trap lines in the lower valley. It was a routine trip. He should have been back by sunset. Sunset came. The sky turned a bruised purple, then black. Tobias did not return. Elspeth paced the cabin. She fed the fire. She checked the door. The temperature was dropping fast, hitting 20 below. He's fine, she told the empty room. He's the ghost of the bighorns. But ghosts don't freeze, and men do. By midnight, she couldn't wait. She dressed in every layer. She owned her calico dress, Tobias's spare wool shirt, a heavy coat he had sewn for her from a blanket and fur-lined boots. She grabbed the Winchester and the lantern. She stepped out into the dark. The wind was merciless. Elspeth followed the tracks of horse, but the drifting snow was already filling them in. She walked for an hour, her lungs burning her fear, screaming at her to turn back. Then she heard it. A low, pained whinny. She crested a ridge and saw them. Down in a small ravine, Horse was thrashing in deep snow. Beside him, a dark shape lay still. Tobias! She slid down the ravine, half falling. Tobias was half buried in a drift. His leg was twisted at a sickening angle. Horse had stepped in a badger hole, thrown him, and rolled. Elspeth fell to her knees beside him. He was conscious, but barely. His skin was grey, his lips blue. Elspeth, he slurred. Go back. Too cold. Shut up, she snapped, panic making her fierce. I'm not going anywhere. She tried to move him, but he was dead weight. He groaned, a sound of agony that tore at her heart. She couldn't carry him. She couldn't lift him onto the horse, even if the horse wasn't spooked. She looked around. The ravine was a trap. The wind was picking up. Then she saw eyes. Yellow reflective eyes in the darkness of the tree line. Then another pair. Then a third. Wolves. They had smelled the blood from the horse's scraped leg. They were waiting for the cold to finish the job. Tobias saw them too. He fumbled for his knife, his hand shaking so badly he dropped it in the snow. Elspeth, run! They want the horse. Run! Elspeth stood up. She looked at the wolves. They were bold, stepping out of the shadows, gaunt and hungry. The leader, a massive grey beast, snarled, baring teeth that looked like ivory daggers. She looked at Tobias, the man who had bought her, fed her, healed her hands, and taught her to stand. The man who told her she wasn't useless. She racked the lever of the Winchester. Clack, clack. She planted her feet in the snow. She leaned into the stock. Be the rock. Get away from him! She screamed, her voice echoing off the canyon walls. The Alpha lunged. Elspeth didn't close her eyes. She breathed out. She squeezed. The rifle roared, a flash of fire in the dark. The Alpha crumpled mid-air, dropping into the snow a yard from Tobias's boots. The other wolves froze. Elspeth racked the lever again. She fired a warning shot at the feet of the second wolf. Snow sprayed up. The pack turned and vanished into the timber. Silence rushed back into the ravine, ringing in Elspeth's ears. She stood there, the smoking rifle in her hands, trembling violently. Elspeth! Tobias was looking up at her. His eyes were whoot clear and filled with something she had never seen before. It was awe. She lowered the gun. I hit it. You hit it, Tobias whispered. He reached out a hand. She dropped the gun and grabbed his hand. He pulled her down, not for warmth, but to touch her to verify she was real. His grip was iron hard. You came for me, he said. You were late for supper. She choked out tears, finally spilling over. Tobias looked at the dead wolf, then back at the woman who had been sold for $20. Help me up, wife, he said. The word hung in the frozen air. He hadn't called her girl or Elspeth. He called her wife. And as she wedged her shoulder under his arm to help him stand, Elspeth knew the thaw had finally come. Getting back to the cabin was a blur of agony and adrenaline. Elspeth had managed to get Tobias onto the saddle of the spooked horse, tying him down with the lengths of rope he kept for trapping. She walked the 3 miles back through the snow, leading the horse, her hand frozen to the bridle. Every muscle in her body screaming. When they finally crashed through the cabin door, the real battle began. Tobias's leg was broken, a clean break of the tibia. Thank God, not a shatter, but the cold had done its work. By the time Elspeth managed to cut his boot off and splint the limb with straight branches and strips of linen, Tobias was shivering so violently the entire bed frame rattled. Whiskey. He gritted out his teeth, chattering. Top shelf. Pour it on the leg. Then down my throat. She did as he asked. The smell of alcohol and old blood filled the small room. When she poured the spirit over the swollen purple bruising of his shin, he didn't scream. He just arched his back, a guttural growl, tearing from his throat, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the buffalo robe. The next 3 days were a descent into hell. A fever took hold, fierce and burning. Tobias, the mountain of a man who could strangle a wolf, was reduced to a thrashing, delirious weight. He burned with heat, sweating through the sheets, until Elspeth had to change them hourly, washing the soiled linens in melted snow water that froze her hands red. He talked in his sleep. The silence he had cultivated for years broke under the fever's hammer. Don't let them in. He mumbled, his eyes wide, but seeing nothing. Sarah, the fire, too much smoke. Elspeth sat by his side, wiping his forehead with a cool rag. I'm here, Tobias. It's just me. It's Elspeth. They took the corn, he whispered, a tear leaking from his eye, a sight that terrified Elspeth more than the wolves. They burned the barn, Pa. Why didn't you stop them? Elspeth listened, piecing together the fragments of his broken soul. He wasn't just a hermit by choice. He was a man haunted by a past violence, a farm raid, a fire, a family lost. He had come to the mountains not to conquer them, but to hide in their indifference. On the fourth night, the fever broke. Elspeth had fallen asleep in the chair next to the bed, her head resting on the mattress, her hand loosely holding his. She woke to the feeling of calloused fingers brushing her hair. She jerked up. Tobias was awake. His eyes were sunken, and he looked 10 years older, but the blue gaze was clear. The delirium was gone. "You're still here," he rasped, his voice sounding like dry leaves. "Where else would I go?" Elspeth asked, her voice thick with sleep. She poured him a cup of water. "Drink." He drank greedily, then fell back against the pillows. He looked at her, really looked at her. He saw the dark circles under her eyes, the soot on her cheek, the raw, cracked skin of her hands. "I called for Sarah," he said quietly. "You did. She was my sister. She died when I was 12. Raiders." "I know," Elspeth said softly. "You told me. You told me a lot of things." Tobias looked away, shame coloring his pale cheeks. A man shouldn't weep. A man shouldn't be weak. Elspeth stood up. She walked to the window, looking out at the vast white prison of the mountain. "My father said I was useless because I couldn't plough a field. He said I was weak because I cried when he hit me. But you know what I learned this week, Tobias?" She turned back to him. "Weakness isn't crying, and strength isn't just muscles and guns. Strength is staying. Strength is keeping the fire lit when the wind wants to blow it out. You kept me alive when I was nothing. I kept you alive when you were broken. We are even." Tobias stared at her. The silence stretched, but it wasn't empty. It was heavy with a new understanding. "No," he said finally. "We aren't even. You saved my life, Elspeth. That debt doesn't get paid with a pouch of gold." He reached out his hand. She took it. "Come here," he whispered. She sat on the edge of the bed. He pulled her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles, the very knuckles he had healed with bear grease months ago. It was a gesture of such reverence, such tenderness, that Elspeth felt her breath hitch. "I don't have much to offer," he said. "A broken leg, a cabin in the middle of nowhere, a scar that scares children." "I don't see a scar," Elspeth said, and she meant it. "I see the only home I've ever known." Spring arrived with the violence of a flood. The snow melted into rushing torrents, turning the mountain paths into rivers of mud. The world turned green, a vibrant, shocking emerald that hurt the eyes after months of white. Tobias was up and moving. He walked with a limp, leaning heavily on a cane he had whittled from hickory, but his strength had returned. He and Elspeth worked side by side now. There were no orders, only a shared rhythm. They were a unit, a partnership forged in ice. But the thaw brought more than flowers. It brought men. It was a Tuesday when the dogs started barking, two majestic wolf hybrids Tobias had traded for earlier in the spring to guard the perimeter. Elspeth was hanging laundry on the line. She froze. The dogs weren't barking at a squirrel. They were barking a warning. Tobias emerged from the stable, his rifle already in hand. He moved to Elspeth, pushing her behind him. "Inside," he ordered. "Bolt the door. Don't open it unless I say the word. Who is it? Riders. Heavy horses. Too many for a hunting party." Elspeth ran inside, grabbing the Winchester from the rack. She didn't hide under the bed. She stood by the window, cracking the shutter just enough to thread the barrel through. 5 riders emerged from the tree line. Elspeth's blood ran cold. In the lead, riding a black gelding with silver tack, was Zeke Pardon. Beside him rode her father, Josiah Calloway, looking more haggard and shrunken than she remembered. The other 3 were hired gunsmen, with low hats and tied-down holsters. Pardon reined in his horse 10 yards from the porch. He looked at the cabin, then at Tobias, who stood like a statue on the steps, his rifle held loosely but ready. "Morning, Rourke," Pardon shouted, a false smile plastered on his doughy face. "Mighty fine piece of land you got up here. Hard to find." "You found it," Tobias rumbled. "Now turn around and lose it." Pardon chuckled. Now, is that any way to treat guests, especially family?" He gestured to Josiah. "I brought the girl's daddy for a visit. He missed his little Elspeth." Josiah wouldn't look at the cabin. He stared at his saddle horn, shaking. "He sold her," Tobias said. "He has no daughter." "About that," Pardon said, his voice hardening. "See, Josiah here got to talking when he was drunk. Told me you paid in pure dust. Heavy nuggets, river gold Rourke, the kind that comes from a mother lode." Pardon leaned forward. "You didn't just find a few flakes. You have a mine up here, and seeing as this land isn't technically surveyed, I'd say it's open for claim." "There is no mine," Tobias said. "I trapped for 20 years to fill that pouch." "I don't believe you," Pardon sneered. "And even if there isn't, I've decided I want a refund on the girl. She's my property by rights of the debt Josiah owed." "She's my wife," Tobias roared, the sound echoing off the cliffs. "I don't see a priest," Pardon yelled back. "Boys, kill the cripple. Find the gold. Grab the girl." The 3 gunmen drew, but they were slow. They were town bullies used to scaring farmers. Tobias Rourke was a predator. Tobias dropped to one knee, firing before the first gunman cleared leather. The shot took the man in the shoulder, spinning him out of the saddle. Gunfire erupted. Bullets chewed into the logs of the cabin. Tobias rolled behind the water trough, levering his rifle. Inside the cabin, Elspeth didn't scream. She breathed out. "Be the rock!" She saw the second gunman aiming at Tobias, who was pinned down. She lined up the sights. Crack. The gunman's hat flew off, and he slumped forward, clutching his arm. Pardon's horse reared. "She's shooting! The bitch is shooting at—" Pardon screamed, pulling his own pistol. He fired wildly at the window. Glass shattered, raining over Elspeth, but she didn't flinch. Outside, the third gunman rushed the porch, thinking Tobias was reloading. Tobias swung his heavy cane, cracking it across the man's knees. As the man fell, Tobias drove the butt of his rifle into his jaw. It was chaos. Smoke screams the smell of cordite. Suddenly the door kicked open. Elspeth spun around. It was Josiah, her father. He had slipped off his horse and flanked the cabin while the shooting happened. He stood there, a rusty revolver in his hand, shaking. "Elspeth," he stammered. "Elspeth, girl, put the gun down. Pardon just wants the gold. Tell him where it is and we can go home." "Home." Elspeth looked at the man who had traded her for seed feed. She held the Winchester level with his chest. "I am home." "He's a monster," Josiah cried. "Look at him." "He's a man," Elspeth said, her voice steel, "which is more than you ever were." "I'm your father." "No," Elspeth said. She cocked the hammer. "You're a trespasser. Drop the gun, Josiah, or I swear by my mother's grave I will drop you." Josiah looked into her eyes. He saw no fear. He saw a woman he didn't recognize, a woman forged in the winter of the Bighorns. The gun clattered from his hand to the floor. Outside, the shooting stopped. Elspeth kept the gun on her father and walked to the door. Pardon was on the ground, Tobias's boot on his chest, the barrel of the Winchester pressed against his forehead. The hired guns were groaning in the mud. Tobias looked up. He saw Elspeth standing in the doorway, her father cowering behind her. He saw the fierce, protective fire in her eyes. "Get them out of here," Tobias growled to Pardon. "Take your trash. Take the coward inside. If I ever see a shadow of you on this mountain again, I won't shoot to wound. I'll leave you for the wolves." Pardon, pale and trembling, scrambled up. He helped his wounded men onto their horses. Josiah stumbled out, not daring to look at Elspeth, and mounted his horse. They rode down the mountain in a ragged, defeated line. Tobias watched them go until they were specks in the valley. Then he turned to the porch. He dropped his rifle and sat heavily on the steps, clutching his bad leg. Elspeth set her gun down and sat beside him. She reached out and took his hand. It was covered in gunpowder and dirt. "You called me wife?" she said quietly. Tobias looked at her. The adrenaline was fading, leaving only the raw truth. "I did." "Did you mean it?" Tobias reached up and brushed a shard of glass from her hair. "I never say anything I don't mean, Elspeth. Summer in the high country is brief, but it is glorious. The meadows exploded with wildflowers, columbine, Indian paintbrush, and lupine. The cabin had changed. There were curtains in the windows now sewn from blue calico. There was a garden patch fenced in against the deer where Elspeth grew potatoes and hardy squash. The silence was gone, replaced by the sounds of living. They didn't go down to Sweetwater for a priest. They didn't need one. One evening under the canopy of 1,000,000,000 stars, Tobias took Elspeth to the edge of the plateau overlooking the world below. He wore a clean shirt. He had trimmed his beard. He looked nervous, something the wolves and Pardon hadn't been able to make him feel. "I don't have a ring," he said, his voice gruff. "Gold caused us enough trouble." Elspeth smiled, the wind catching her hair. She wore a dress she had made herself, fitted and strong. She wasn't the skinny girl anymore. She was healthy, vibrant, and dangerous. "I don't want gold, Tobias." He reached into his pocket and pulled out something else. It was a bracelet intricately carved from the antler of an elk. He had spent months on it, carving scenes of the mountains of pine trees and a tiny detailed wolf. He fastened it around her wrist. It fit perfectly. "The mountain is harsh," Tobias said. "It kills the weak, but it keeps what is true. You are part of this mountain now, Elspeth, and you are the only part of me that isn't broken." He took her hands, the hands that could scrub a floor, shoot a rifle, and heal a wound. "Elspeth Calloway is dead," he whispered. "She died in that saloon." "Then who am I?" she asked, tears shining in her eyes. "You are Elspeth Rourke," he said. "My partner, my equal, my wife." He kissed her, then not with the desperation of the winter, but with the promise of the summer. It was a kiss of endurance, of two jagged edges fitting together to make something whole. They stood there as the moon rose, casting silver light over the peaks. Down in the valley, the town of Sweetwater continued its petty squabbles, its greed and its noise. But up here above the clouds, there was only peace. The man who wanted silence had found a symphony, and the girl who was sold as useless had built a kingdom. They turned back toward the cabin, where the fire was warm, the door was strong, and the gun was hung over the mantel, ready but resting. This wasn't just a story about the Wild West. It was a story about the labels the world tries to put on us, useless, broken, scarred. Josiah saw a burden. Tobias saw a survivor. The world saw a monster. Elspeth saw a protector. In the end, Elspeth didn't need to be rescued from the tower. She needed someone to hand her a rifle and tell her she was strong enough to pull the trigger. True love isn't about finding someone who is perfect. It's about finding someone who helps you fight your battles, who values your scars, and who builds a home where you can both be safe. If you believe that everyone deserves a second chance at a life worth living, hit that like button. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded of their own strength, and subscribe for more tales of grit, survival, and romance from the frontier.